Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed wedding photo on the nightstand. The smiles captured in that moment felt foreign, like a relic from another life. The love was still there, wasn't it? She wasn't sure anymore. What she did know was that the space between her and Daniel had grown into something vast and unspoken. Nights spent alone had become routine, his side of the bed growing colder with each passing week. She used to wait up for him, eager to hear about his day. But now she barely had the energy. The loneliness had crept in slowly, disguised as patience and understanding. She told herself that Daniel was working hard for their family, that the late nights, the exhaustion in his voice, were all for their future. But the future felt distant, and the present felt hollow. She missed the days when they couldn't get enough of each other, when a simple touch could say more than words. Now, the house was filled with silence, punctuated only by the mechanical rhythm of their routine. She wasn't sure when it had started, but the truth was undeniable. She felt more alone in her marriage than she ever had before. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the distant clatter of cups and silverware. Lillian traced the rim of her coffee mug, lost in thought, when a deep voice pulled her back to the present. "Mind if I join you?" She looked up, startled, to find Vincent standing beside her table, his dark eyes steady, his smile easy, a familiar face, yet not one she had expected to see tonight. He had always been around an old family friend, a passing presence at gatherings, but now, in the dim glow of the cafe, he felt like something else entirely. "You look like you could use some company," he added, his voice warm, smooth, assured. She hesitated, glancing at the empty chair across from her. There was something in his gaze, something knowing, as if he could see the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. Against her better judgment, she nodded. As Vincent sat down, their conversation began easily, light-hearted even, but soon, Lillian found herself saying things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. She told him about Daniel's absence, about the weight of feeling unseen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, someone was truly listening. Lillian sat in her car outside the house, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The conversation with Vincent lingered in her mind, his words curling around her like smoke. Impossible to ignore. "Are you sure he's really at work?" He had said it so casually, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. She shook her head, pushing away the unease creeping up her spine. Daniel worked late. He always had. It was part of who he was, a provider. A man dedicated to his job. But why was it getting harder to believe? Why had it taken him 3 calls to finally pick up tonight? With a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and dialed again. It rang once, twice. On the third, Daniel answered, his voice edged with concern. "Lillian, everything okay?" She swallowed. "Yeah, I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause, then a sigh. "It's a busy night. I'll call you later, okay?" The call ended before she could respond. Lillian stared at the phone in her hand, a hollow feeling settling in her chest. Maybe Vincent was wrong. Maybe she was imagining things. Or maybe she wasn't. The house was dark when Daniel finally came home. Lillian sat on the couch, her hands curled around a mug of tea long gone cold. She had been waiting for him, watching the clock tick past midnight, listening for the familiar hum of his car in the driveway. Now, as he stepped inside, exhaustion written across his face, she searched for something, anything that would put her fears to rest. "You're up late," Daniel said, shrugging off his coat. His voice was neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something guarded. Lillian forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded, running a hand through his hair before stepping toward the kitchen. She followed. "Work was busy?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Yeah," he didn't elaborate. She studied him, the way he avoided looking at her, the way his fingers gripped the counter just a little too tightly. The doubt Vincent had planted took deeper root. "Daniel," she hesitated, heart pounding, "are you happy?" That made him pause. His jaw tightened slightly before he turned to her, offering a tired smile. "Of course I am," he said, but something in his voice told her he was lying. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside Lillian's mind. Rain pelted against the windows, each drop a steady drumbeat to the thoughts racing through her head. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, Vincent's last message lingering on the screen. "Are you sure he's really at work? Have you ever checked?" Her fingers hovered over the call button, hesitating. She hated that the seed of doubt had been planted. She hated even more that it was starting to grow. With a deep breath, she pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. A chill ran down her spine. Daniel always answered, always. Her grip tightened around the phone. She tried his work number next. No answer. The air in the house suddenly felt thick, suffocating. Lillian's heart pounded as she tried to push the paranoia away. But the questions wouldn't stop. Where was he? Why hadn't he called? And then another thought struck her, colder than the rain outside. What if Vincent was right? Lillian set the phone down with trembling hands, staring at the screen as if it held the truth she wasn't ready to face. Lillian sat in the dim light of her childhood bedroom, the weight of the divorce papers pressing against her lap. The ink on the pages felt final, cold, and merciless. Her mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than any words ever could. "You thought this was just harmless, didn't you?" Margaret's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "A few stolen moments. A man who made you feel special. But look where that led you. Lillian." Lillian's throat tightened. "I didn't cheat, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "Not really." Margaret scoffed. "Not really? You let another man into your heart. You let him plant doubt in your mind. You entertained the idea of someone else while your husband was breaking his back to provide for you. Tell me, does that not count as betrayal?" Tears burned at the back of Lillian's eyes. She had told herself 1,000 times that she hadn't crossed a real line, that she had caught herself before it was too late. But now, looking at the reality before her marriage in ruins, her husband refusing to even speak to her, she wasn't sure anymore. Daniel sat in the dimly lit lawyer's office, his fingers tracing the edge of the divorce papers as if stalling would change anything. Across from him, Lillian sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes searching his face for a flicker of warmth that wasn't there. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, filled with everything they weren't saying. "I never wanted this," Lillian finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to lose you." Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You didn't lose me, Lillian. You let me go." Her chest tightened at the truth in his words. She had told herself that her flirtation with Vincent had been harmless, a brief escape from the loneliness she felt in their marriage. But standing on the other side of it now, she realized how much damage she had done. She had chipped away at the foundation of their trust until there was nothing left to hold them together. Daniel slid the papers toward her. "Sign them," he said, his tone unreadable. "Or don't. It won't change anything." Lillian swallowed hard, blinking back tears. She had never imagined their love story would end like this. Lillian sat in her childhood bedroom, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like a stone. The house was eerily quiet, except for the distant murmur of her mother, Margaret, speaking to Thomas in the living room. Their words were indistinct, but she knew they were about her, about how she had ruined her marriage, how Daniel had finally walked away. She stared at the divorce papers in front of her, her name printed neatly in bold ink. A signature was all it would take to finalize what she had never thought possible. She had spent the past week replaying every moment, every decision that had led to this, searching for a way to undo the damage. But no amount of regret could rewrite the past. The worst part was knowing Daniel no longer cared enough to fight. He had grieved the end of their marriage long before she had even acknowledged its fractures. Now, he wasn't angry, just done. A soft knock at the door startled her. Margaret stepped inside, her expression tired but not unkind. "Lillian," she said gently, "if you want any chance at redemption, you need to stop mourning what's lost and start proving you've changed." Lillian sat across from Daniel in the small conference room at the law office. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The air between them was thick with finality. But not anger, not anymore. He was calm, composed, as if he had already moved on. That realization twisted like a knife in her gut. The lawyer slid an envelope across the table. The paternity test confirms that Daniel is the biological father of both children, he said, his tone professional, detached. Lillian let out a shaky breath of relief. But Daniel didn't react. He only gave a slight nod, as if he had expected this all along. Once the lawyer stepped out, she turned to him, desperation clawing at her throat. Daniel, now that you know the truth, can we talk? His gaze met hers, unreadable. We are talking. She swallowed hard. I mean really talk. About us. About what comes next. He exhaled slowly, leaning back. What comes next is co-parenting. I'll always respect you as their mother. Lillian, but us? He shook his head. That chapter is over. Tears burned her eyes. She had lost him not to another woman, not to time, but to her own choices. Lillian stood by the window of her childhood bedroom, staring out at the gray sky, her reflection barely visible in the glass. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors as her mother moved downstairs. The divorce papers sat on her desk, the ink dry, the weight of finality pressing against her chest. It was over. She had lost Daniel not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in the slow unraveling of trust, in the choices she had made that she could never take back. She had spent the last few weeks in a haze, replaying every mistake, every moment she had ignored the warning signs in her own heart. Vincent had been a fantasy, an escape, but never real. Daniel had been real, his patience, his devotion, the quiet way he had always made sure she was cared for. And she had thrown it all away. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Crying wouldn't fix this. Begging wouldn't fix this. The only thing left to do was to move forward. Not for Daniel, not even for redemption, but for herself. She had to become someone she could respect again. Life is built on choices, and every decision we make has consequences. Lillian's story is a reminder that neglecting communication and seeking temporary comfort in the wrong places can lead to irreversible damage. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to feel disconnected from loved ones. But instead of turning to outside validation, focus on strengthening the relationships that matter. Be honest about your feelings. Address issues head-on, and never take loyalty for granted. Trust is fragile once broken. It's difficult to rebuild. If you're feeling lost in your relationship, seek clarity before making choices you'll regret. Value what you have before it's too late.